Oh boy, do I have some f***ing opinions. Buckle up, folks, because this one's going to be a bit longer and a bit of a change of topic from what we typically cover on this show. But it's an episode I feel like I have to do because not talking about how the politics inherent in our hobby intersect with politics in the real world feels irresponsible right now. I need to make a few things clear up front though. I am an able-bodied, straight, cisgender, middle-class white man. For anyone interested, my pronouns are he and him. These things almost never affect me personally. And while I have a fair bit of academic knowledge of the topics I'm going to cover, I have no lived experience of their impacts. So first up, there is important work and advocacy being done by LGBTQIA people, people of colour and disabled people about the politics of our hobby and related hobbies. Go and watch Conquest of Dread's video on decolonising gaming. Watch Tom Vassel's interview with Eric Lang. Watch that Jess's video on the subtly fascist messaging of the fantasy genre. Follow Eric Lang, Omari Akil, and every LGBTQIA and Black, Indigenous and person of colour you can find who is talking about politics and gaming. We've included some links in the down there as a starting point. Secondly, while this is a show about my opinions, these aren't just my opinions this time. This script has been reviewed by several people with extensive lived, academic and activist knowledge of the topics I'm going to talk about, who gave their time to help me get it right. You should follow them too. Links in the down there. With all that said, I'm going to show my hand a little bit and talk about what this video is and what it isn't. What I'm not here to do is put anyone on blast. That includes the designers of some of the games I'm going to mention, or you, if you happen to like these games. There are undoubtedly some people in the industry who should be called out, but this is not that video. I'm also not here to talk for any culture or identity that I'm not a part of. The reviewers of this script come from diverse backgrounds and have given me advice on how I should talk about some of these topics, but I'm not speaking for their personal experiences. And I couldn't if I tried. What I am going to talk about is how politics are, and always have been, part of gaming. How the themes of games are political, and how choices in the mechanics and playing of games are political. And I'm going to talk about why this matters. Consider this a primer on these topics. This is the start of the conversation, not the end of it. Before we can do that though, we need to lay out some definitions. And if we're going to say that games are political, we should probably start by defining what we mean when we say political. In political theory, politics is about explaining why things are the way they are, how they could be, and what we should do even if they'll probably never be the way we think they should be. It's also about what happens when your values need to translate into the real world. Simply put, your politics are your beliefs about who and what is important, who and what isn't important, and what we should do about those things. And if you hear that definition and think, but that would mean everything is fine and I don't want to think about any of this is a political opinion, then you'd be absolutely right. And you should also know that being able to choose not to think about politics means you're already privileged. Not everyone is so fortunate as to be able to just tune it out. This broader definition that goes beyond just governance structures and hierarchies is why you might have heard the phrase, everything is political. And if you only take one thing away from this video, I hope it's that. Now, we also need to do a few other quick definitions so you'll know what I mean when these terms come up later in the video. The default is what a society or community regards as normal for that community and the people within it. Things that are not the default are then talked about in ways that highlight their difference from it. It's why Matt Leacock is referred to as a game designer, but Eric Lang is often referred to as a black game designer. Matt is just closer to our community's default of white and male. Base assumptions are things that you recognize as fundamentally true about the world without necessarily even realizing it. In gaming terms, that might be higher numbers are better than lower numbers on dice rolls. Everyone plays games to win, or nobody really enjoys Monopoly. In real life terms, it might be everyone has equal opportunities to access employment. They aren't necessarily true, but they form the foundation of how we view the world. Gaze refers to the assumed perspective of the audience of a piece of work. If you've heard the term before, it was probably in relation to media that uses images of scantily clad, beautiful women to appeal to the male gaze, but media can adopt any gaze. The black gaze, the queer gaze, the female gaze are all possible, just not so common. Coding is the conscious or unconscious use of stereotypes in the design of a fictional thing as an indirect way of telling an audience how they should feel about that thing. A particularly notorious example is the way that the evil races in The Lord of the Rings are described in ways that draw on Asian, African, and Middle Eastern stereotypes. Cultural appropriation is the use of one culture's art, language, fashion, religious imagery, or other cultural artifacts by someone from a different culture in a way that strips them of their original meaning and doesn't compensate the originating culture for their use. It's like how Ghost Stories uses the style of Chinese wuxia cinema, but the only Chinese name I could find in my copy of the rulebook was in the publisher's special thanks section. Cultural appropriation also opens up issues around who gets the money from works whose appeal, in part, comes from the appropriated aesthetic, but we're not going to get too much into that today because we could honestly spend an entire video on that topic. And to be really clear, I don't know how much research Antoine Bauza did in the development of Ghost Stories, and nor do I know how a Chinese person might feel seeing their culture represented in that game. I'm just citing it here as an example of a form of appropriation. Once again, I'm not here to put anyone on blast, and I'm not here to speak for cultures or identities that I'm not part of. Okay, groundwork done. Thanks to everyone who stuck with me this far. So, what does all of this mean in terms of the themes of board games? Let's do a quick compare and contrast. Spirit Island is a game where players take on the roles of Polynesian-inspired deities who have awoken to help the island's indigenous people, the Dahan, resist the explicitly European invaders attempting to colonize it. It's a game that centers an indigenous perspective, is pro-environment, and portrays colonialism and imperialism as dangerous forces that need to be resisted. A lot of coverage and discussion of Spirit Island talks about these political aspects, and designer Eric R. Reyes has been very clear that their inclusion is very intentional. And while Reyes, to my knowledge, isn't part of any indigenous culture, Polynesian or otherwise, he has been very clear in his developer diary, link in the down there, about how seriously he took the responsibility of creating the Dahan and the ways in which they were coded. Small World is a game where players take on the role of silly fantasy races battling over a map. Each turn, they go out and conquer as much land as possible, destroying or driving out any existing occupants. At the start of the game, this includes the Lost Tribes, isolated groups scattered around the map who ultimately represent little more than a speed bump for our expanding armies. And I've never heard anyone call Small World a political game. I mean, does that seem like it should be strange? This is a game where aggressive imperial expansion is the way we win points. And not only are the indigenous peoples not given agency in the game, their conquest is an assumed part of the game's progression. I mean, that sounds pretty political to me. So why does no one talk about Small World's politics the way they talk about Spirit Islands? Because of the default. If you're a white person from a Western country, as most game developers are, imperialism, conquest, and the disempowerment of indigenous peoples are part of the background noise of your civilization. Either you live somewhere that was colonized, or you live somewhere that did the colonizing. I definitely don't think Philippe Kiertz set out to make a political game in Small World, but that's the trick of the default. Those ideas seem so normal to many of us that they don't even seem political anymore. Instead, it's the Spirit Islands, the games that deliberately push back against the default, that seem political, while those that don't. Remember, politics is about who and what matters, what ideas matter, and what we should do about those things. In Small World, Indigenous peoples are just a speed bump to the glory of an expanding empire. In the Resistance, standing against the encroachment of massive and powerful corporations is a noble, if dangerous, stance to take, and those corporations are sneaky and ruthless. In Vengeance, vigilante violence is an appropriate response to being wronged by gangs, many of which are coded with some pretty ugly stereotypes about minority groups. And look, I like all these games. I maintain that there is a lot to like about all these games. Vengeance, as well as being rooted in the revenge genre of cinema, which I have a real soft spot for, includes a diverse and positively coded cast of player characters. It also has a gang coded as white supremacist bikers, who I always pick as my personal target for Vengeance. As for the Resistance, actually that's a political stance I kind of jam with. Small World is a delightfully cartoony fantasy wargame. And like I said, I genuinely don't believe that Philippe Kiertz set out to say that imperialism is good, actually. But it's important that we recognize and analyze the problems with the things we love. It's part of how we grow. And I'm not here to put anyone on blast for the games they make or the games they love. This isn't that video. But once you start to look closely at games, you start to see how political they are. Because everything is political. And the personal is especially political. Here at Cook That Game, we shelved an entire episode where we played Vengeance, because with the murder of George Floyd and the beginning of popular uprisings against police brutality, it wasn't the right time for that episode. I don't know if it ever will be. I'm not even addressing historical games right now and the decisions those designers make about whose narratives to center, because I could, and at some point probably will, make an entire video about that. It is a whole can of worms. And for sure, an abstract game like Uno has no politics in its theme because it doesn't have one. But there are still politics in Uno because the designers of Uno made decisions arising from their own base assumptions and from the default. Because Uno assumes that everyone playing it can see color. And not everyone can. At least not the way the designers of Uno do. And this is the other way in which politics shape gaming. When designers design games, they're making assumptions, consciously or otherwise, about what the people who might want to play their game are able to do. Often these decisions arise from assumptions that what the designers themselves are able to do is what anyone playing their game is able to do. But you can't play a dexterity game if you have a medical condition that inhibits your dexterity. And you can't play a memorization game if your memory is impaired. This is where I should give a huge shout out to board game review site Meeple Like Us, link as always in the down there part, which looks at games through the lens of accessibility. That includes giving full consideration to how a whole range of different impairments might affect someone's ability to play a game. At the time of recording, they're on hiatus, but their archive is extensive and vital. And there are other things that can limit people's ability to access certain games. For example, the decision to pack a game to the gills with expensive components means that game becomes almost inaccessible for people with limited financial means. And our personal experiences also shape how we respond to different mechanisms. Omari Akil has talked about how certain elements of his game Rap Gods that white playtesters didn't like specifically the randomness of the beef system and the potential for a runaway leader, didn't bother him, because those kinds of arbitrary mechanics resonated with his experience as a black man in the United States. I've known people who couldn't play any game with social deception mechanics because experiences that they'd had in their lives meant being lied to was so stressful and upsetting that it triggered genuine trauma. And I've known people who couldn't play any game with take that mechanics because for them, it felt like abuse. Putting these mechanics in a game is a choice. And all of these choices, conscious or otherwise, come from a place that weighs up who and what is important, who and what isn't important, and what we should do about that. They come from a place that's political. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have dexterity games or games with take that mechanics, although making games colorblind friendly seems like it should be a bit of a given. We can have, should have, all kinds of games. But this stuff matters. It matters to me because I want our hobby to grow and attract more and more gamers. And it matters because more diverse viewpoints creates strength and innovation. I want anyone to be able to approach our hobby and find games where they see themselves represented, not as tired and lazy stereotypes, but genuinely and with understanding. I want everyone to be able to find games that appeal to them, regardless of their identity or level of ability. But creating the world I want for gaming requires choices. And if we're going to make good choices, we need to think about what's driving the choices that we're making. Good games shouldn't be built on lazy base assumptions and designed solely for the default. I want to see more games from designers who've considered whose gaze they're centering, how they're presenting cultures and identities that aren't their own, and what would prevent someone from being able to access their game. I want LGBTQIA people, disabled people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color to feel welcome in gaming. A hobby that is still mostly dominated by white, able-bodied, neurotypical, cisgender, straight, middle-class guys. Not so that every game can be for everyone, but so that everyone has games that are for them. And so that no one is made to feel like gaming doesn't want them. Politics is part of gaming, because politics is part of everything. And if we continue to say politics should stay out of games, not only are we wrong, because politics are and always have been in games, but we're taking a political stance ourselves. We're saying that the default, the straight, cisgender, able-bodied, neurotypical white guy perspective, is more important than any other. That feeds into our views about the world, not just our views about games. And it's pretty much why things are in the state they're in right now. If we say nothing, we're saying we're fine with how things currently are. Things aren't fine, and they have to change. It's only by considering how politics impact on our games that we can choose which politics we include and the kinds of worlds that our games represent. Normally, this is the bit in the video where I say that this is just my opinion, but in this case it's not. Partly because none of these ideas are actually terribly contentious in academic and activist circles, but also because a number of people helped me with this script. I'd like to give huge thanks to Dr. Sahra Rae Taylor, Rowena Specht-Whyte, Travis Vries, and Sarah Molaski for giving me their time, energy, and experience to help me get this script right. Follow their work, including Travis's excellent podcast for originals, through the links below. And because this was just a primer about these topics, next week we're doing something a little bit different. Sahra, Rowena, Travis, and Sarah will be joining me for a roundtable conversation where we dive a bit deeper and talk about how these issues have affected their lives, both at and away from the gaming table. We've also included a list of links to non-profits and charities that support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, LGBTQIA people, and asylum seekers in Australia, because those groups need our support now more than ever. If you can give, please do. This is also the first video we're doing where the comments will be pre-moderated. We're very happy to have a conversation about all of this, but we will be ruthless in deleting any trace of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, or any other bigotry. In conclusion, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, Disabled Lives Matter, because gaming should be for everyone, and I want to see everyone at the table. Actually, I'm going to put one developer on blast. Cards Against Humanity is a trash game whose message is, it's funny to be cruel. Also, it turns out that as a developer, they're a massive racist garbage fire. Links, with massive content warnings, in the down there. Get in the fucking bin, Cards Against Humanity.